Welcome to the Dragon of Forgotten Myths channel. Here we travel back in time together so that you can fall asleep safely and usefully. Don't forget to subscribe and like it. By the end of this lecture, sleep will cover you firmly and confidently. Close your eyes. The story is already beginning. For centuries, people have been afraid of creatures returning from the world of the dead. Among them, the vampire became the most striking and frightening image. Today, he is the hero of novels, films, and TV series, but once upon a time they believed in his existence quite seriously. Vampires were considered the cause of diseases, epidemics, and misfortunes. They were so feared that the dead were buried with extreme care, trying to prevent their return. The question arises, where did this unusual fear come from, and why did the image of a vampire penetrate so deeply into the human consciousness? Blood has always been perceived by people as something sacred and at the same time frightening. It symbolized life and vitality. That is why creatures capable of drinking blood seem to be the epitome of a deadly threat to human existence itself. Psychologists explain the myth of vampires with a deep fear of losing vital energy and control over one's own destiny. And mythologists believe that the images of blood-sucking creatures arose as an attempt to explain sudden deaths, epidemics, mysterious diseases, and fear of the unknown world after death. It is noteworthy that similar ideas existed among different peoples independently of each other. In the myths of different cultures, creatures associated with death and nocturnal activity appear, which gave rise to the image of a nocturnal predator returning from the afterlife. Today we will trace how the image of the vampire has changed in different eras and in different cultures. From Slavic and Romanian legends to the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, the prototype of the famous Dracula. We will find out what methods people use to protect themselves from these creatures, from peasant rituals to official investigations. The phenomenon of vampirism is not only a story of fear and superstition, but also a reflection of cultural, historical, and even medical features of human life. This myth is older than it seems. The fear of blood-drinking creatures goes back to the dawn of civilization. Even the Sumerians, who inhabited Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, believed in spirits and demons returning from the dead to torment the living. Among them, Ekimu and Utuku stood out especially, disembodied ghosts of the dead who could not find peace and wandered at night in search of vitality. They were considered not just symbols of death, but a real threat from which they had to defend themselves with rituals and conspiracies. In ancient Egypt, the image of bloodthirsty creatures acquired even more impressive features. Here, mythology was closely intertwined with history. One of the most striking examples is the legend of the goddess Sekhmet, a warrior with the head of a lioness, the daughter of the sun god Ra. According to the myth, humans angered the gods, and Ra sent Sekhmet to punish humanity. The goddess slaughtered people with fierce fury, shedding blood and ruthlessly drinking it. Humanity was on the verge of extinction. Ra realized that his daughter was too destructive, but it wasn't easy to stop her. Sekhmet was drunk on blood and wasn't going to stop. Then God played a trick. He ordered the fields to be filled with beer, dyed red to make it look like blood. Sekhmet mistook the drink for real blood, got drunk, and fell asleep. That's how people escaped death. This story is symbolic. The blood here is not just a liquid, but life itself. Sekhmet's thirst for blood reflected people's fear of the wrath of the gods, disease, and death. In this myth, the features of the classic vampire image are already discernible: thirst for blood, power that cannot be resisted, and the need for special magical ways of protection. Thus, long before the legends we know appeared, humanity was already creating images of bloodsuckers that reflected its deepest fears and beliefs. Now, having got acquainted with the ancient origins, let's fast forward to the world of ancient Greece and Rome. Here, the images of bloodsuckers become closer to the modern idea of vampires. They acquire tragic fates and human features. Empusa, Lamia, and Strix are particularly prominent among them. Empusa, the messenger of the goddess Hecate, was able to change her appearance and appear before travelers in the form of a beautiful girl in order to seduce them and drink blood. These stories reflected fears of the dangers of night roads and the unknown. Lamia, the former queen of Libya and Zeus's lover, became a victim of Hera's jealousy. Having lost her children on her orders, Lamia became distraught with grief and turned into a bloodthirsty demoness who hunted other people's children and drank their blood. This image absorbed not only the fear of the supernatural, but also the horror of the loss of loved ones, which turns a person into a monster. In Roman mythology, there was a similar creature, the Strix, a terrifying bird with huge claws that drinks the blood of babies. The word Strigoi, which was used to denote vampires in Eastern Europe, later came from its name. To protect themselves from the Strix, the Romans performed special rituals, hung amulets, and recited spells. Thus, already in antiquity, the main features of future vampire legends took shape: victim seduction, nocturnal attacks, blood drinking, and the tragedy underlying the transformation of man into a monster. The images of Empusa, Lamia, and Strix became the most important prototypes for future vampire legends. These myths spread throughout Europe and became part of the cultural heritage of mankind. Now, having analyzed the ancient origins, let's turn to the Slavic traditions, the world of ghouls and strigoi. Here, myths are intertwined with real fears and everyday practices. In Slavic culture, vampirism acquired vivid and peculiar features, embodied in the image of a ghoul. But unlike the romanticized vampire aristocrat familiar to modern man, the ghoul was a creepy and untidy figure of a dead man rising from the grave to torment loved ones and destroy the life of villages. It was believed that a ghoul became a person who died an unclean death, a suicide, an executed criminal, a victim of a terrible illness or violent death. Those who were cursed during their lifetime or buried without proper rituals were also dangerous. The fear of the return of the dead was so great that people developed a number of rituals. Suspicious dead were buried face down so that they would lose their orientation and would not be able to leave the grave. Stones were placed in the mouths of the dead, heavy slabs were placed on their chests, and an aspen stake was pierced through their hearts, symbolically keeping them in the world of the dead. Archaeologists are still finding similar burials throughout Eastern Europe, which confirms the reality of these fears. It was also believed that if the deceased became a ghoul, he would return to his house at night and ask to be let in a voice similar to a human. Anyone who succumbed to pity and opened the door risked getting sick, dying, and becoming a monster himself. These superstitions sometimes took on such a serious character that they attracted the attention of the authorities. One of the most famous cases occurred in Serbia in the 18th century. In 1726, the peasant Arnold Paul died in the village of Medvedja. After a while, the residents began to die from a mysterious disease, and people decided that Arnold, who had returned from the other world, was to blame. The panic was so great that it reached the Austrian officials. They opened the grave and found that the body had not decomposed, but there was blood on the lips. To calm the residents, the body was pierced with a wooden stake and burned. A similar fate befell several more suspicious dead. This case was widely discussed in Europe and became one of the first official investigations of vampirism. Thus, the image of a ghoul in Slavic myths and real stories was far from romantic. He represented the fear of illness, death, and unexplained phenomena. Fast forward now to Eastern Europe, to the lands of Transylvania and Romania, where the mythology of vampirism has acquired a special character. Romania is a country at the crossroads of cultures and religions, where wars, instability, and epidemics have reigned for centuries. People lived in constant fear of illness and sudden death. It was in such circumstances that the myth of Strigoi was born, the living dead, or cursed souls, doomed to return to drink blood and torment loved ones. It was believed that evil and cruel people became Strigoi, as well as those who died violently. They were credited not only with bloodlust, but also with supernatural powers. The ability to transform into animals, control the weather, and cause diseases. Every sudden illness, death, or crop failure in the villages could be attributed to the curse of the Strigoi. The fear of them penetrated deep into everyday life, and therefore the legends about Strigoi were passed down from generation to generation. One of the most famous stories is called The Night of the Strigoi's Return. An old miller died in one village, a greedy and evil man. People were afraid that he would become a Strigoi. The first 2 nights after the funeral were quiet, but on the third, when the moon was full, a strong wind picked up, and the dogs began to howl. The village was in a panic. Everyone hid, hanging garlic on the doors and windows. Only the blacksmith decided to come out. With an aspen stake and a cross, he went to the cemetery. As he watched, the ground on the miller's grave began to move, and the deceased began to rise. His face was pale, and his eyes shone with an eerie fire. The blacksmith, overcoming his fear, drove a stake into the dead man's heart. The Strigoi let out a piercing scream and collapsed back into the ground. The next morning, the peasants found a body with an aspen stake in its chest, and since then it has not disturbed the village anymore. Such traditions have reinforced belief in Strigoi and the need for protective rituals for centuries. Therefore, in Romania, the Strigoi is not just a myth, but a part of the collective memory and traditions that have survived to this day. Next, we turn to the figure who became the prototype of the most famous vampire in history, Vlad the Impaler, known as Dracula. When we hear this name, we most often imagine a gloomy aristocrat from a novel by Bram Stoker. But the literary image appeared later. In reality, there was a prince of Wallachia, whose name terrified his contemporaries and became the basis for many legends. Vlad III was born in 1431 in Transylvania. His father, Vlad II, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, created to fight the Ottoman Empire. Thanks to this, the son received the nickname Dracula, son of the dragon. But later it became a symbol of horror when Vlad was nicknamed the Impaler or Impaler. His childhood was spent in conditions of political intrigue. In his youth, he and his brother were held hostage by the Ottoman Sultan. Years of humiliation and constant death threats have made him tough, withdrawn, and distrustful. When he returned home, he learned that a ruler must be merciless, otherwise he would die. Wallachia was located between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary, and Vlad used brutality as a political tool to keep power. His main sign was execution by impaling. Although this method existed before him, it was Vlad who turned it into a symbol of intimidation. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II sent a huge army against Wallachia. To stop the enemy, Vlad ordered thousands of captured Turks to be impaled on stakes along the roads to the capital. This forest of bodies shocked the Ottomans so much that they preferred to retreat, considering Tepes to be a madman who could not be fought. Vlad's cruelty was manifested not only towards external enemies. Harshness became his main method of governing within the principality. He mercilessly punished anyone he considered traitors, thieves, or conspirators. There is a known case when Vlad invited boyars suspected of treason to a feast, and immediately after the meal ordered them to be executed by impaling. This brutality was not a whim, but a deliberate policy of intimidation. Vlad understood that only fear could ensure order and unity in his small principality. His methods are not random or senselessly bloodthirsty. On the contrary, they were part of a carefully calibrated survival strategy. The Balkans of the 15th century were an arena of incessant conflicts, where each small principality was forced to balance between powerful empires. For Vlad, fear has become the main instrument of power. Sultans, Hungarian kings, local boyars, everyone should have been so afraid of him that they would not even think of betrayal or invasion of his land. Vlad could not afford to be weak. Otherwise, his principality would inevitably become the prey of stronger neighbors. Thus, the real historical Vlad Tepes was not just a cruel tyrant as portrayed by later chroniclers and pamphlet writers, but a product of his time. In that harsh era, only extreme measures could guarantee political survival. It was this figure, full of contradictions and gloomy grandeur, that became the basis for the creation of the literary Dracula, whose image overshadowed historical reality. But before moving on to Bram Stoker's novel, it's worth figuring out exactly how the Irish writer turned this historical figure into the most famous vampire in world culture. The story of Vlad the Impaler could have remained only a part of medieval chronicles and terrifying legends, if not for Stoker. His novel Dracula, published in 1897, forever changed the perception of the Wallachian prince, turning him into one of the most famous monsters of literature. Many believe that Vlad Tepes was the sole prototype of the literary Dracula. However, everything turned out to be much more complicated. Stoker was inspired by several sources at once: historical chronicles, European legends, and even Irish myths. In his library was William Wilkinson's book, An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, 1820, which for the first time mentioned the name of Dracula and brief information about the prince's cruelties. But the impact didn't stop there. A less obvious but no less important source of inspiration was the Irish legends. In local folklore, there were creatures similar to vampires. One of them was the red bloodsucker, a woman betrayed by her lover, who returned after death to take revenge, feeding on the blood of the living. This image of a romantic and at the same time tragic monster had a significant influence on the creation of Dracula. In addition to mythology, Stoker actively used images of Eastern Europe, which in the 19th century was perceived in the West as a land of mysticism and superstition. Although the writer had never been to Romania, he described it as a mysterious and frightening country, inspired by the stories of travelers. For the Victorian British, it was an exotic land, perfect for a Gothic novel. Thus, the literary Dracula was the result of combining several layers: the cruel story of Vlad the Impaler, the ancient legends of Europe and Ireland, as well as the romantic imagination of the author. It was this combination that made the image of Dracula so attractive and convincing. The 16th and 18th centuries were the time when belief in vampires reached its peak. This phenomenon has transformed from a local fear into a large-scale pan-European phenomenon. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, people exhumed the dead en masse, pierced the bodies with aspen stakes, and burned them in an attempt to stop the epidemic of vampirism. In conditions of constant diseases, plague, and tuberculosis, such actions seemed to be the only way to protect themselves. People did not know the medical explanations and turned to the supernatural. The mass panic reached such proportions that it attracted the attention of the authorities. Empress Maria Theresa even issued a decree prohibiting the arbitrary opening of graves, as hysteria caused riots. A special contribution to the spread of belief in vampires was made by the work of the French monk and scientist Augustin Calmet, a treatise on the phenomena of spirits and vampires, 1746. Although Calmet tried to give rational explanations, he collected a lot of eyewitness accounts, government reports, and descriptions of exhumations. His work had the opposite effect. People perceived it as confirmation of the existence of vampires. The book quickly became popular and increased panic. Today, historians believe that most cases of vampirism were attributed to diseases. Tuberculosis, for example, caused pallor, sudden loss of strength, and death, which people attributed to vampire attacks. Catalepsy led to the fact that a person could be buried alive, and his return later gave rise to legends about the risen dead. The story of Angel Hayes from France is well known. He was mistakenly buried, but a few days later, his relatives opened the coffin and found him alive. Such cases gave rise to the custom of equipping coffins with an alarm system, with a rope and a bell, so that the deceased could give a sign. Thus, the vampire hysteria was not just a surge of superstition, but a reflection of the fears of its time, of disease, death, and the unknown. Now that we have dealt with the social and medical roots of fear, let's turn to the next topic. Real vampire hunts and stories, where even the authorities and the police were forced to investigate such cases. The history of vampires and the belief in their existence did not end with the era of mass panics of the 15th century. On the contrary, this theme continued to live in later times, taking on new forms. One of the most unusual characters who influenced the perception of vampirism in the early 20th century was the English priest and writer Montague Summers. A mysterious and controversial figure, he was born in 1880 and devoted his life to the study of the supernatural and mystical. A priest by training, Summers was convinced that vampires really existed and posed a real threat. His books became not just scientific works, but a kind of guidelines for the recognition and destruction of bloodsuckers. The most famous of them is The Vampire, His Relatives and Brothers, 1928. In this book, he gave historical examples, folk legends and eyewitness accounts, described the signs of vampires and methods of dealing with them. Readers were offered practical advice: how to protect yourself from attacks, what objects and rituals to use. Special attention was paid to aspen stake, holy water, crucifixion, prayers and incantations. Thanks in large part to Summers, so-called vampire hunter kits appeared in Europe and America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These expensive cases, covered with velvet or leather, contained stakes, crosses, holy water, prayer books, and even pistols with silver bullets. Today, such sets are considered collectible artifacts and are sold at auctions for huge sums. Even in the 20th century, belief in vampires continued to excite minds. In the early 1970s, a story broke out in London that went down in history as the vampire from Highgate Cemetery. Residents of the area said that at night in the cemetery, they saw a tall figure in a long cloak with a pale face and glowing eyes. Someone claimed that this shadow hovered above the ground and disappeared into the darkness. The panic was so great that the police launched an official investigation. Despite night patrols and interrogations of eyewitnesses, no evidence was found, and the case was closed. But the legend of the Highgate vampire continues to live to this day, attracting mystery lovers from all over the world. Similar cases have occurred in America. In 1854, a mysterious epidemic broke out in the village of Jewett City, Connecticut. People died from the disease, accompanied by exhaustion and weakness. The residents decided that the dead were to blame, rising from their graves. According to the decision of the local authorities, several graves were opened. The bodies, which were better preserved than expected, were seen as evidence of vampirism. The corpses were burned to stop the disease. This case was one of the last officially documented episodes of the vampire hunt in the United States. With the development of science, many legends about bloodsuckers have received medical explanations. Porphyria is a rare hereditary disease in which the skin becomes extremely sensitive to light. The patients' faces and hands were covered with burns and scars. Their skin turned pale, and their teeth looked elongated, like fangs. People avoided the sun and went out mostly at night, which gave rise to rumors of vampirism. Tuberculosis caused severe exhaustion, pallor, and a bloody cough. When the disease claimed entire families, it seemed that the dead were sucking out the life of living relatives. It was then that residents began exhumations. Rabies has also contributed to the myth. Infected people became aggressive, afraid of the light, bit others, and behaved inappropriately. All of this fit perfectly into the image of a possessed vampire. The most famous case in America occurred in 1892 in Rhode Island. In the Brown family, the mother and the eldest daughter died, and the youngest son, Edwin, fell ill. The residents decided that the reason was a vampire among recently deceased relatives. 19-year-old Mercy Brown came under suspicion. When her grave was opened, her body turned out to be well preserved, and blood was found in her heart. For the locals, this was proof. The heart was burned, and the ashes were given to Edwin as medicine. But he died soon after. The cause of the tragedy was ordinary tuberculosis. This story has become the latest high-profile case of vampire panic in the United States. Despite the fact that belief in vampires seems to be a relic of the past, a phenomenon has emerged these days that is called modern vampirism. There are communities of people who consider themselves vampires. Some claim that they have a physical need to drink blood. The process takes place voluntarily, with medical checks and strict rules. Others consider themselves to be energy vampires, fueled by the emotions of others. Scientists attribute this phenomenon to psychological causes, in particular the so-called Renfield syndrome, an obsessive craving for blood. Modern vampires join clubs, arrange meetings, even hold annual balls, for example in New Orleans. For many, it is a way of self-expression and identity search. The history of vampires is a journey through centuries and cultures. From ancient demons and gods, from the fears of the Middle Ages, and the legends of Vlad the Impaler, to modern societies, the image of a vampire has always been a mirror of human fears and hopes. He absorbed everything: medical ignorance, social anxiety, and mythology. And that's why vampires continue to live in our culture, as a symbol of the secret, frightening, and attractive.